Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story tells about a girl who appeared in a completely different and imaginary world. She could never understand why absolutely no one loved this unfortunate child who just wanted attention. She believed that if someone, even just one person, had given him love, the ending would definitely have been completely different. It all happened in one day, and it completely changed the girl's fate. A man with a girl with bright green hair in her arms approached the boy and, addressing him by the name Lucian, asked why he had come out at all. This little girl was the heroine who had been reborn. She immediately became interested when she heard about Lucian. The guy standing opposite with his head down said that he heard that his younger sister was arriving, and that was why he came out to meet her. And at that moment, the girl finally realized that she knew him, that she had seen his face somewhere before. It took her a while to figure out where exactly, but soon she remembered that she had read a story on an internet site before her reincarnation. Before moving into another body, she lived like garbage, locked within the four walls of her miserable and sad room. And on top of everything else, there was something that only made her even more depressed, namely the story she had been following for 3 years. The ending of this story, which was called "There's Another Doll in the Dollhouse," simply left her in complete shock. When she turned the page, she saw her favorite characters hugging, and after that, it was written that this was the end. The girl was ready to just scream throughout her entire apartment, not understanding how this could possibly be the end. She immediately started writing a review in the comments, saying that this was the most terrible and sad ending. She even called the author a real idiot and said that he had no conscience. Thus, she simply did not notice and fell asleep in the process of writing a malicious comment to the author. And after she opened her eyes, it turned out that she was already in a completely different place. As soon as she opened her eyes, a strange girl addressed her. She called her Milady and asked if she could raise her head for a moment. After that, the woman handed her a box with various jewelry and asked which of the brooches she liked best. The girl did not expect at all that after she opened her eyes, she would see a completely new world in front of her. She began to quickly look around, and for some time could not understand at all where she was. And soon she finally realized that this was the very same resettlement that she had only heard about before. She used to really like reading stories on the internet and immediately realized what was what because she often came across this genre. She immediately became curious about what kind of story she found herself in, a novella or a manhwa. But then she realized that it didn't really matter. Suddenly, the doors to her room opened and a very beautiful young woman ran in, who, upon seeing her, immediately smiled and said that she was very glad to see her. A man immediately followed her. He also approached her and, calling her his daughter, said that she was incredibly beautiful that day, as always. Thus, the love of caring parents for the body into which she moved step by step healed her soul, which was always empty and gloomy. And over time, the girl became completely accustomed to the fact that she was not in her usual life, but in a completely new and unfamiliar one. She was now the only daughter of the Count's fief, Orlando Rachel de Orlando. Some time had passed since she had moved into her body, and her father, approaching her one fine sunny morning, said that he and his mother needed to leave for a short while. He also asked Rachel if she could wait for them. The girl immediately said that, of course, she would wait for them with impatience. The man hugged his daughter and, smiling, said that he was sure that he could count on her, so he thanked her for that. Even though even their love was not intended for the real girl who ended up in Rachel's body, it was actually quite enough for her. She just wanted to continue living this new happy life in which she finally experienced what love was. However, the day they left was the last. And all because her parents had a carriage accident and left this world forever. And while Rachel was drowning in her sorrow and grief for her dear loved ones, her uncle took over the title and absolutely the entire family line. Then an imperial duke came to her and said that he would adopt Rachel. He told her uncle that he was very sorry and sorry for their tragedy, and that he knew that my lady was now completely alone, so he wanted to take good care of her. When he first saw Rachel, he extended his hand and said that he was her godfather, and was a very close friend of her father, Liam. He took the girl with him with all her things and told her that she could be absolutely calm because he would protect her, and no one would even dare to touch her with a finger now. Her uncle was very surprised by such behavior and said that she was his niece and he should take care of her. However, the Duke managed to persuade him. Then Rachel felt that she was much safer with this man than with her greedy uncle, so she believed him. When they were riding in the carriage, they were silent the whole time because they didn't even know what they could talk about. It was too awkward and uncomfortable a situation for both of them. When she heard his name, namely Leon, she immediately realized that she had heard it somewhere before, but she could not remember where exactly. Some time passed from that moment, and now they finally stopped near a huge estate in which Rachel was now supposed to live. The man took her by the hand and went out into the street, and the girl, when she saw all this beauty, could not even contain her surprise. Then Leon, taking her in his arms, smiled and said that everything that belonged to the ducal family now belonged to her. He hugged her and said that she was Liam's child and that she was like his own daughter to him. However, at that moment, a small boy with black hair suddenly came out to them and addressed his father. The man, when he saw him, was very surprised and asked Lucian why he had come out at all. The guy immediately replied that he heard that his younger sister was arriving, so he came out to say hello to her and get to know her in general. Leon immediately smiled and said that he was proud of his son because he had finally done something that he would like. He said that since the guy had actually come out and waited for them the whole time, he would introduce them anyway. Then the man replied that the girl he was holding in his arms was Rachel de Orlando, and from now on they would all live together. In fact, Rachel was very familiar with the young man who stood right before her eyes. He had long eyelashes and eyes the color of gold, and the guy also had scarlet lips and an indifference on his face. Even that small mole right under his eye was very familiar to her. And all because this boy was the hero of the very story that she read before she was reborn, and was also her favorite character. It was the repentant madman Lucien de Leon. After Leon introduced the girl, he glanced at her and said with a smile on his face that very soon she would also become Rachel de Leon. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised, but at that moment she finally understood who exactly she had possessed. It was Rachel whose body she had taken over, and she was Lucian's younger sister. In fact, in the original story, Duke Leon spoiled her too much as a child, and after turning into an arrogant brat, she bullied poor Lucian in every way. And that is why she ended up being cannon fodder, and was the first to die at the hands of her own brother. And when Rachel finally realized all this, she was simply in a panic. She could not believe that this really happened to her. The girl looked at her new relative with fear, and Lucien did not understand why she had such a strange reaction. All Rachel could think about at that moment was that she didn't want to die. She knew that she couldn't possibly die at the hands of her favorite character because he was so wonderful and she loved him so much. Soon after she was brought to the estate, she was immediately taken to a room, and Rachel, sitting on the couch, tried to analyze the whole situation. She thought about the fact that there was another doll living in the doll's house. Well, Lucian's youth from the virtual novel turned out to be unusually unhappy, even though he was from a noble family. Many may wonder why everything was so unhappy for him, but the answer is actually simple. He had to endure violence from his own father every day. Lucian's father and the man who brought Rachel to this house was Duke Pedro de Leon. Of course, he also suffered abuse from his father, the previous duke, and that is why he simply did not know any other model of behavior and raised his son in the same way. The reason for this was his love not for women but for men, and the one Pedro loved was, in fact, Rachel's father, Liam de Orlando. The two carefully nurtured their love under the guise of friendship, until one day the previous duke found out about it. From that moment on, the beatings and psychological violence began, allegedly for educational purposes, Pedro. However, in the end, the man simply broke up with Liam and married the lady who was chosen for him by the previous duke, that is, his father. Pedro was determined to leave his guilty conscience and love for Liam behind, and he decided to be a good husband to his wife and a wonderful father to their future child. However, he was never able to love his son, who was the spitting image of his hated father over all these years. Rachel, who was eating the goodies that were brought to her upon arrival, sighed heavily and realized that male love figures even in the history of fathers. However, the most important thing on her agenda was Lucien's condition and her horrible death. She thought that she needed to collect her thoughts as soon as possible, because things weren't as bad as they might seem. But living under the same roof with her favorite character, on the contrary, can make the ardent fan happy, so she decided not to despair too much. Suddenly, someone knocked on her door. For a while, she did not know what to do. But after that, she allowed him to enter, realizing that she was in a noble society where this was what one had to do. Then the door to the room opened, and it was her Lucien who walked in. As soon as the guy appeared before her eyes, she was almost blinded by his beauty. Rachel couldn't believe that he was really that stunning, and she didn't think that a guy would have such an impact on her with just his looks. The guy didn't pay any attention to her reaction and, coming closer to his sister, said that he wanted to talk to her. Rachel, immediately smiling, said that, of course, they could do whatever he wanted. Lucien didn't really like the way she spoke at all. However, he decided not to show it and calmly sat down at the small table opposite her. Rachel at that very moment began to look at him attentively and did not take her eyes off him for a second, because she admired his beautiful appearance. But at that moment the door to the room opened again, and then the maid came in. She greeted Rachel and said that she was her new personal maid. But as soon as the maid came inside and saw Lucien, she was very surprised and also greeted the young master. But Rachel didn't pay any attention to the maid's reaction. On the contrary, she was glad that the maid had come and said that she was just in time, so she asked her to bring them another cup of tea. But then suddenly the maid began to feel very uncomfortable and anxious. She was about to say that it was Rachel, but quickly changed her mind. The girl did not immediately understand why she reacted so violently to a simple request, but then Lucien suddenly turned to the maid and said that he had come in for a short while. Rachel immediately decided to take matters into her own hands and, smiling, told the maid that her brother had come to see her, so she didn't understand at all what the problem was. The maid immediately realized her mistake, so, bowing, she asked the mistress to wait a little, and new tea would be ready. After that, she went out the door to prepare her drink. Rachel decided to be very hospitable, so, handing him a cup of tea, she told her brother to drink it, since she hadn't even touched it yet. But Lucien immediately turned away from her and said that he couldn't do that. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She looked him straight in the eye and immediately asked why he couldn't take some tea, and the guy calmly replied that it was not time for a meal yet, so he would not drink tea. Rachel was very surprised to hear this. She was simply furious, not understanding what kind of stupid rule this was, because they were not in the army. However, at that moment, she finally truly understood her purpose. She decided that she had moved into this story for the sake of her favorite, to save him. It was incredibly painful for her to look at his thin wrists, which indicated that he did not eat at all. He was nothing but skin and bones. Rachel couldn't understand how he was supposed to grow up healthy and manly if he barely ate anything. She understood that the same Madgon could not remain so thin. So first of all, she was going to fatten him up and change the character settings. Despite all the respect she had for the author and his vision, Rachel wasn't going to just sit and watch her favorite meet a tragic end. And she actually wanted to live too. And that was why she was going to change absolutely everything in that world. So smiling, Rachel asked her brother cautiously if he really had a certain time for eating. Lucien immediately said that this was indeed so. He lived according to an established routine and must always adhere to it. When Rachel heard this, she thought that if this continues, she will really go crazy. After all, if we are talking about the routine mentioned in the original story, then he trains alone at dawn before the sun rises. The guy also eats food that is clearly not suitable for a growing body, and he eats very small portions. And after all this, he goes to the Duke for his punishment. Even though he might not have done anything wrong, he still received beatings from him. Rachel couldn't believe that Lucien actually meant this horrible routine. However, What angered her most was the fact that he took the beatings from the Duke, which were disguised as discipline, for granted. And from the reaction of that maid, it became obvious to her that no one had bothered to tell him that this was really strange and abnormal. This is precisely why brainwashing is a very scary thing. A person can become so lost that he no longer knows his own opinions and desires. So after a moment of silence, Rachel said back that she had heard that for peace of mind, it was better to make 2 schedules in advance. The boy looked at her with an older look and immediately asked what she was talking about, but the girl said that it was indeed true. Rachel explained that he should have a first master routine and a second one in case the first one doesn't go as planned. Lucien immediately thought about this and, looking away, said that he did not know about it. The girl was immediately glad that he believed her. So with a smile on her face, she said that now he would know and, perhaps, take action. She explained that if he created 2 routines for himself to be prepared for unexpected situations, life might become a little easier, and he might even start to feel better. The man was silent for a while, and then said that he needed his father's permission to do this. He certainly wouldn't do it just like that on his own. Rachel immediately looked at him with a pitiful look and asked him to make sure he got this permission. In fact, she was ready to burst into tears because she felt incredibly sorry for this man. She had read the original and already knew what to expect at the end, but she couldn't even imagine that his life was so similar to a doll's. They were silent for a while. Then Rachel said that they were one family now, and her family always got together for tea, so it was terribly hard for her to hear him refuse. Lucien immediately realized that she would not leave him alone so easily. So, sighing heavily, he said that he would try to ask his father for permission to do this. She immediately became happy, and clapping her hands, said that she was very glad to hear this, and also thanked him for his efforts. Rachel also said that she would look forward to it. Some time had passed since then, and they had already managed to talk and drink tea. Then the man had to leave. The girl accompanied him, and waving goodbye, said that the tea party had been very fun, and she was glad that he had spent this time with her. Lucien also smiled at her one last time and left. When the man walked out the door, he sighed heavily and then moved on. In fact, he assumed that she would turn out to be just a small, ignorant child who only wanted to play and get attention. However, to his surprise, Rachel was too smart and was able to immediately determine her position. Of course, her position was different from his. After all, he had not even managed to gain the recognition of the head of the family. And that's why the guy assumed that she had set him an impossible task in the form of a tea party. But he also thought about actually having 2 plans in his schedule. As soon as Lucien left, the maid came to the girl again and asked her to allow her to introduce herself formally again. The maid bowed and said that her name was Amber and that she was her new personal maid. Rachel, upon hearing this, immediately smiled and asked Amber to take good care of her. The maid also smiled and said that in that case, she would help her change into a new dress and accompany her to the dining room. The girl immediately did so, and soon Rachel was walking along the corridors to the dining room, and at that moment she was trying to mentally collect herself because there were still a lot of different things waiting for her ahead. In order to avoid the miserable end that the original story has in store for her and save her beloved Lucien from terror, Rachel must first change the Duke's feelings. Suddenly, Rachel became very interested in whether the Duchess would be present at the dinner. After all, she was Lucien's mother. In fact, the Duchess was a girl named Camilla de Leon, and also Duke Pedro's partner in a political marriage. As far as Rachel knew, she was suffering from real depression, so she didn't know what relationship she should have with her son now. However, Rachel also thought that perhaps she was just pretending not to know this, just to avoid burdening herself and getting involved in the situation. The girl sighed heavily and thought that she had ended up in a not very good family because everyone had mental health problems. But then suddenly the maid stopped her. Seeing her surprised expression, she immediately asked if something had happened. And also before that she said that they had already arrived. Rachel immediately said that nothing had happened. Then Amber opened the door and told her to come in, because the Duke was already waiting. As soon as Rachel entered the room, she immediately saw a huge table which was filled with various food. The choice was very diverse. She couldn't believe that this was really true and not a dream, and she also didn't understand why they had prepared so much of this. But raising her head up, she saw Pedro, who smiled joyfully at the sight of her, and said in a gentle voice that he was very glad that she had come. Rachel didn't answer this. She began to slowly approach the place that had been prepared for her, and she was very worried. The girl did not understand why there was absolutely no one there, but she assumed that most likely Lucian and the Duchess were simply delayed. But then she suddenly remembered that she was next to the Duke, so she had to watch her facial expression. So she quickly dropped her serious look. Rachel sat down at her place and smiling greeted the Duke, and then she asked if there really was no one else coming. She said there was so much food on the table that she thought they wouldn't be alone, but the man smiled and said he wanted to spend time alone with his daughter, so he decided not to invite anyone else. When Rachel heard his address, she was very surprised and could not believe that he had already managed to adapt to it so quickly. But then she suddenly realized that this was precisely why her original character had become arrogant rather quickly, all because from the very first day he had started spoiling her and treating her as if she were a queen. Rachel, of course, was very pleased about this, but she believed that this care should have been intended mostly for Lucian. This made her feel quite awkward. Soon they began their meal, and after a short silence the girl said that she was curious about something, so she asked if she could ask him a question. Pedro was a little surprised when he heard this, but said that of course she could ask the question and not even ask beforehand if it was okay to do it. Then she looked at him with a surprised and slightly worried look, and in a quiet voice asked if he would really adopt her. Pedro immediately became very serious and said that of course it was so. After all, it was the godfather's duty to become her new guardian, and he was going to do just that. Rachel couldn't believe that this man actually saw her as part of this family so strongly. Then the man smiled and asked in a saccharine voice if she had any other questions. Of course, she had something that interested her most, so she plucked up her courage and decided to ask this question anyway, because she needed to somehow improve the atmosphere in that house. So Rachel looked her father straight in the eye and asked him if he didn't eat with his older brother. Of course, from the outside, she looked very sweet and innocent, but of course, in her head, she really wanted him to quickly call her favorite and apologize to him for doing this at all. But Pedro managed to get out of it. He smiled slightly and said that Lucian had his own meal schedule, so unfortunately it didn't always coincide with his. When Rachel heard this, she became very angry, because she had already heard about this crazy daily routine more than once during the day. She didn't understand why it was necessary to make this routine for a child at all, thereby complicating his life, because at his age he should be frolicking and having fun, and not working as hard as Lucian does. But now it became clear to her why they started calling him a doll. When he grew up, the boy simply did not have his own opinion and always obeyed someone else's, doing it all like a robot. But the girl still wanted to insist on her own way, so with a smile on her face she asked if they really couldn't eat together, and she would really like to sit at the same table with him. Pedro was very surprised when he heard these words. He only looked at the girl but did not answer. Rachel even started to worry a little at that moment, thinking that she had served it all up too brazenly, but she still hoped that thanks to this, Lucian would be able to eat properly. After a while of silence, Pedro, with a smile on his face that he had to force out, told the girl that he would do whatever his daughter wanted. And in a rougher voice he turned to the servants, asking them to bring this child anyway. Rachel immediately smiled and thanked the Duke for doing this. The man did not react to this at first, but after that he took her hair in his hands, examining its beautiful green color, and sighing heavily, said that she even thanked him just as much as he did. Rachel didn't immediately understand who he was talking about, but then she remembered her father, who had died, and realized that when he looked at her, he saw not her personality, but Liam. Despite the fact that she understood all this perfectly well and knew that in this case it was not even the real Rachel, the girl did not understand why her soul felt so hurt by this. But at that moment a servant entered the room and said that Milord Lucian had arrived. Then the door opened, and a guy really did enter the room. He looked incredibly tired, because he had just been training, and also a little surprised because his father had never done this before. But Rachel, as soon as she heard that her new brother had arrived, immediately beamed with joy and could not take her eyes off him. She thought that her favorite was, as always, irresistible, and was very happy to see him at this dinner. When the man sat down at the table, she immediately smiled and said that the food was very tasty, and asked her brother to try at least a little too. Of course, it was her cunning plan to feed him more so that he would gain weight over time, so she tried to force this food into him in every possible way. The father did not react to this in any way. He only continued to admire his daughter, and Lucian at that moment nevertheless listened to his sister and decided to try the plate that was brought to him. And as soon as a small piece of food got into his mouth, his eyes immediately lit up with joy because usually he was given completely tasteless porridge, which was dry and even cold. Some time passed from that moment, and soon the dinner was over. Then the maid came for Rachel, and the girl, before leaving, said goodbye to them, and also thanked the Duke for the food. The man immediately waved goodbye to her, smiling, while Lucian stood behind him, his head down and showing no emotion at all. In fact, she was incredibly happy then that she was able to have dinner with her favorite character. However, Rachel could not have imagined that her hasty mercy would only make him suffer more. After she had gone quite a distance, Pedro turned to his son in a quiet and rough voice, telling him to come to his office. That same evening, Lucien began to return from his father's office, where he had thoroughly punished him for no apparent reason at all. The boy was very upset, but not because he was beaten, because he was already used to it, but because he thought that his father had finally recognized him as his own son. However, when Lucian came to his father's office, he immediately said in a rough voice that he had heard that he had smugly shown up at Rachel's for lunch. Pedro started yelling at his son, asking what this even meant and how he could not have reported it to him. Lucian did not want to answer anything because he was uncomfortable with all this, but he remembered the girl's request and decided to try anyway. He lowered his head, turned away from his father, and said in a quiet voice that since she was now his little sister, he decided that he could do this. But Pedro interrupted him mid-sentence and said that Rachel had begged him to invite her to the table, so he asked how he could persuade an innocent child who didn't even know him to do this. Lucian was about to say something in his defense, but his father interrupted him again and told him not to think of doing anything stupid. After this, he took the stick with which he always beat his son as a sign of punishment in his hands and said that, apparently, he needed to be taught a proper lesson in order to correct his bad head. And soon, when Lucian was returning to his room, he stopped because he began to feel very bad. The boy found it incredibly difficult to breathe. He immediately leaned against the wall, but he could not understand why he began to choke after the lesson his father taught him. Soon, when he felt a little better, he went on further in the hope that he would be able to return to the room as soon as possible in order to rest. Lucian wanted to be in a place where there was no one, and at that moment it was just his room, so he spent most of his free time there. The next morning, when Rachel woke up, the maid immediately brought her many small but beautiful dresses. Amber explained that these dresses were a gift from the Duke, and the girl was very surprised by such a large number of outfits. But the maid began to insist and asked her which one she would like to try on first. Rachel was at a loss for a moment. However, she soon thought about her choice and said that she would like to try on the most modest and decent. And that is why she chose a beautiful, modest blue dress, and not a green one, which even had precious crystals sewn on at some points. Of course, Amber was a little surprised by her choice. However, she did not object and helped the girl change her clothes. Right after Rachel was ready, she went to meet Camilla, and of course the conversation was directly about Lucian's mother. Soon they went up to the top floor, but in front of the door they were met by a maid who was Camilla's personal maid. The girl, seeing the two of them, immediately bowed, and asking for forgiveness, said that the lady could not receive them. She explained that she was not feeling well, so she asked that absolutely no one come in to see her. When Rachel heard this, she was very surprised, because for the first time in her life she had been brushed off with such a petty excuse. But she, of course, should have expected this. After all, no one wants to see a stepdaughter, whom her husband smugly brought without permission. Moreover, this was his beloved's own child, so Rachel understood that such a reaction was not bad. In fact, it was obvious from the moment of her marriage that the Duchess would fall into depression because her husband was forced into an unwanted political marriage who would never love her. This was the husband who hated his own son and cared only for the daughter of his past love. In the original, the Duchess's feelings reached their peak, and eventually the girl could not bear it and threw a huge tantrum. She screamed at her husband, saying that the very first button of this marriage had already been incorrectly fastened, and it was he who buttoned this button. She believed that it was all his fault. The girl cried loudly, but after she said these words, she lost consciousness and eventually died. So Rachel did not insist. She asked the maid to tell her that she wished her a speedy recovery and looked forward to their meeting. In fact, as she was leaving, she looked at the door again and really hoped that Camilla would soon overcome her mental illness and start taking care of her son. It might soon be too late to start doing that, but Rachel felt uneasy about all these thoughts, so she quickly pushed them aside. She thought about the fact that, first of all, she was convinced that now the Lucians had no one to take care of them, except her. So she drew certain conclusions from this. Soon, when they left the room, Amber turned to Meledia and asked if she would be returning to her room or if she wanted to go somewhere else. Rachel immediately said that she was not going to return to the room and asked the maid where her brother Lucian was. Of course, the maid knew, and so at the girl's request, she took her away. At that moment, the guy was sitting in the office, which was too small, but he was studying. And as soon as there was a knock on the door, he immediately went up and opened the door, but was a little surprised, because usually no one bothers him at such a time. But as soon as he opened the door, he saw Rachel right in front of him, and this surprised him very much. At that moment, the girl handed him a whole basket with various fruits and berries and said that she had come to eat together, because she had already missed him. Of course, she knew that he ate whatever he wanted, and that was why she needed to feed him at least a little bit of various vitamins. But the guy removed any emotion from his face, and turning in the other direction, said that he was currently scheduled to rewrite a history book. Therefore, she had better go back to her place. Rachel was a little upset because again that terrible schedule was interfering with them. For a while she just stood there in silence, trying to think of some way out. And after that she asked what was going on with the 2 regulations she had mentioned. Had they really not been drawn up yet? Lucian, returning to his workplace, said that his father had complained about keeping the basic routine, and therefore there would be no 2. The guy continued writing his lessons and said that only in this way could he become the ideal successor who would be able to manage the entire family. Rachel sighed heavily and said that, of course, she couldn't interfere with his routine. When the guy heard this, he wasn't even surprised. He expected her to give in and not fight anymore. He thought that she was a child, and if something did not go her way, she would immediately give it up. However, suddenly, to his surprise, Rachel came up to him and put grapes to his forehead. Lucian immediately looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she was doing, but the girl smiled happily and said that in that case she would put a grape in her mouth herself so that he would not be distracted from his writing. The guy was so surprised that he couldn't even believe that she was serious, so he asked again what she meant. But Rachel told him to keep writing what he was doing and just open his mouth when she asked him to, and that was it. He didn't have to do anything else. After this, the girl immediately brought the grape to his mouth and told him to open it. But for some time the boy did not react to this. This made her a little wary, so she asked him to quickly open his mouth and get back to his schedule. Lucian didn't react to this. Anyway, she then tapped him on the lips with this grape and said that this grape wants to get into his stomach. Therefore, he needs to open his mouth. The guy just looked at her for a while, and then he finally listened to the girl and opened his mouth. Rachel immediately put a grape in there. She was, of course, glad that she had succeeded, because she thought that he would protest to the last. After that, she looked him straight in the face with hope in her eyes and asked him if he liked this fruit. Lucien did not answer, but only looked at her with a cold gaze. The girl immediately felt uneasy. She thought that she had probably been too assertive. She looked at him and could not understand what this empty expression on his face meant. Rachel was very worried that she had done something wrong and thus scared him away from herself. She thought that he probably liked it, but in order not to send him away from her even more, she told him not to pay attention to her, but to continue studying. She would not disturb him at all. But at that moment, the boy noticed that he had pressed too hard on his pen, and because of this, a large blot appeared almost covering the entire sheet. He had to tear the piece of paper out and rewrite it. But then Rachel suddenly turned to him and asked if he would like to try some raspberries. Lucien looked at her, and she said that she would put it in his mouth so that he would not be distracted, and again brought the berry to his lips. But this time, the guy did not open his mouth. When the girl asked him to open it again, someone knocked on their room door, and Lucien immediately became wary, looking at the door. It turned out to be Rachel's maid. She turned to the girl and said that she had come to escort her. She explained that the Duke had summoned her, so they needed to leave as soon as possible. Rachel was very surprised to hear about this, but after that, she put the basket on her brother's table and said that it was time for her to go. She also added that she was leaving the fruit for him, so she asked him to make sure to eat at least a little of it. Before she left, she waved goodbye to him and told him to make the rewriting as quick and easy as possible, wishing him luck. Then the door slammed shut and Lucien was left alone again. For a while he sat silently, looking at the basket, and then he picked up the raspberries that were in it. Without thinking twice, the guy immediately tried it, and then thought that, as expected, it was completely tasteless. However, he suddenly also thought that the berry that Rachel had given him definitely had some kind of taste. But at that moment the guy heard someone's voice behind him. There appeared an angry expression on his face, which immediately inspired sadness and despair. This voice spoke to Lucien, and he said that it was indeed a strange thing, for he could not taste under its influence. And after that, an unknown mysterious creature asked if it was all due to the special magical waves that were emanating from this child. But Lucien interrupted him and told him not to dare even talk to him anymore. However, this voice only giggled, but soon disappeared. And so, some time passed from that moment, so that Rachel noticed that a whole month had already flown by since she moved into the Duke's estate. The Leon family eventually officially adopted her, and she became Rachel, taking on their last name. However, even after all this time, Lucien's mother was still unable to meet her. She kept making up excuses and simply did not let her in. But of course, Rachel understood that if she did not properly greet the wife of the master of the family, it would insult her even more. So she waited patiently and kept telling the lady to get well as soon as possible or to deal with her affairs, if that was the excuse. And yet she really hoped that the lady would soon come to her senses and finally begin to take care of her son, because it was very difficult for him. With the Duke, everything was the same. He still behaved very kindly with Rachel and was friendly. However, as soon as she started talking about Lucien, displeasure appeared on his face, which was difficult for him to even hide. She would really like the man to finally think about what he is doing wrong and start taking care of his son properly, and not just mock him and demand the impossible from him. But Lucien hadn't changed either during all this time. Of course, Rachel thought he was still handsome, but his fatigue and frantic workload made it obvious that he wasn't healthy. The girl was very irritated by the fact that he still kept to his crazy schedule at breakneck speed, despite the fact that he simply couldn't physically cope with it. So in that case, Rachel decided that she would look for some loopholes in him. And when the guy was training, she ran up to him with a box of food that she had prepared in advance and offered to rest a little and have a snack. Rachel also said that he should eat, because that way he would gain more strength and be able to swing his sword again with more energy. But then suddenly, Lucien stopped her in front of him. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he was so indignant. With a heavy sigh, the guy walked away from her and said that it was very dangerous, so she should not come near him under any circumstances while he was training. Rachel immediately lowered her head and apologized to her brother. She said that she didn't know it could be so dangerous, but she wouldn't do it in the future. And smiling, the girl asked if it was true that training took a lot of his energy, and therefore again suggested that he sit down and rest a little. She pointed to her box and said that she had brought him some refreshing iced tea that would only do him good. Lucian did not resist for long, so placing the sword on a special stand, he agreed. Soon they sat down on a bench nearby, and Rachel immediately opened her box to take out all the contents. And there she took out a bottle of cold tea and a glass, and after that she glanced at her beloved brother. Lucian was sweating all over from training so hard. Then he started fixing his hair, and when Rachel saw it, she immediately thought that her favorite was more beautiful than ever on this day. So, pouring him a glass of cold tea, she handed him the drink and told him to drink it, because it could also cause dehydration. Lucian agreed. He took the glass, but then turned to his sister and said that her frequent visits put him in a difficult position. When Rachel heard this, she was very surprised. She immediately asked why this was so, and the boy explained that it was all because he had to move according to his routine, which had been specially worked out. However, when she arrives, he has to redo everything, and he falls behind his schedule. After that, the guy sighed heavily. When Rachel saw this, she was very surprised. But then she thought that of course it was obvious why he was upset. She had been constantly looking for a meeting with him throughout the month, and if she noticed him along the way, she would immediately start a conversation, despite the fact that he might be in a hurry somewhere. It was no wonder that she had become quite boring to him. Therefore Rachel understood everything and simply remained silent for some time. And Lucian, seeing her sad expression, said that it was all because she was not on his schedule, and he, unfortunately, could not devote so much time to her. Rachel immediately lowered her head even lower and said that he was, of course, right. So she asked for forgiveness and also added that in the future she would be more careful. The guy felt bad about hurting her feelings, so he immediately moved closer to her and said that he didn't mean it that way. He explained that the problem was just the schedule. In fact, Lucian said that he is saying all this not because he does not want to, but only because he does not have time for it. Rachel immediately felt pleased. She smiled and thought that he must be worried that his words might hurt her tender little heart. She had never actually seen a person who looked like a doll, like two peas in a pod, express his feelings like that. So she took his hand and said that if the problem wasn't her company and dislike, but simply the schedule, then she wondered why he didn't just include her in his daily routine. Lucian was very surprised when he heard this. He did not understand what she meant, so he asked again and asked her to clarify. When Rachel looked at him, she immediately thought that he had an incredibly cute expression on his face. He was genuinely confused and didn't understand how he could just go and include her in the routine. But Rachel just looked at him with a loving gaze all this time. The guy was silent for a while. Then he decided to try her tea after all and started drinking. The girl, seeing this, immediately began to smile and thought that this guy even drinks just perfectly. He thought about her offer for a while and then said that if he included her in his schedule, she would have to accompany him all day, and asked if that was really what she had in mind. When Rachel heard this, she began to simply glow with joy, even from the thought of it. But she mentally tried to calm herself down because she did not need to show so much emotion. So, suppressing the joy in herself, she said that she asked that as soon as possible he would schedule a time when she could come, and then he would be able to pay attention to her too. Lucian then sighed heavily. His face suddenly began to express sadness and even fear. The guy, turning away from her, said that he needed to get permission from his father, because only then would he be able to fit her into his schedule. Since they had only known each other for a month, Rachel didn't want to push his feelings, so she smiled and said that it was perfectly normal. She looked her brother straight in the eye and also said that she didn't want to cause him any trouble, so he didn't have to do it if he didn't want to, of course. Lucian felt very awkward about this, so sighing heavily, He said that he would still try to ask him, but he did not promise anything. When Rachel heard about this, she immediately became very happy. She began to giggle and thought that she could not even imagine that such a big change could happen. She was very glad that Lucien had begun to change a little and was even ready to argue with his father in order to ensure that she could see him. Rachel immediately stood up from her seat and started dancing, jumping for joy. She was humming a tune, and Lucien just sat and watched it all from the side. However, at that moment, their father suddenly approached them with the maid. He smiled happily and, turning to Rachel, asked what she was doing. Lucien, hearing his father's voice, immediately stood up. He began to be very worried, but greeted him. The man paid no attention to him at all, because Rachel came up to him. He stroked her head and said that Amber had said that her dress was made, so she should go and try it on. He smiled happily, and the guy who was watching all this from the side was ready to burst into tears, because he really also wanted his father to look at him with such a loving gaze. He thought that if he completed the entire program and became the perfect heir, then maybe he would look at him the same way he looked at Rachel. At that moment, he would finally be proud of his son. Then suddenly Lucien heard Rachel's voice. He immediately flinched as he was immersed in his thoughts. However, the girl waved him goodbye happily and said that it was time for her to go, and then she turned around and, together with the maid, ran into the castle. When she finally left, Leon looked at his son and in a stern voice told him to come into his office. Lucien had no other choice, so he soon went into his father's office, where he was already sitting with his punishment club. He looked sternly at his son and asked if he had really failed to straighten out his bad brain. The boy, lowering his head, replied that this was not so at all. Then his father began to shout at him with greater force and asked why, in that case, Rachel wanted to meet him so often. Lucien, sighing heavily, said that he didn't really know either, but he didn't expect it to happen. He wasn't forcing her to be there. She wanted it herself. However, Leon did not listen to him to the end. He looked the guy straight in the eyes and realized what angered him the most. The trigger factor for him was his son's eyes. He remembered his father and the look in his eyes when the boy looked at him. The one who cursed him and Liam, separated them, and ultimately just went and destroyed the man, had exactly the same look. And that's why Leon can't allow people who are the spitting image of such a father to remain near Liam's child. So the man asked in a rough voice if he really thought of using even the innocent Rachel, and then said that the guy was really disgusting. When Lucien heard this, he was very surprised. He was about to say something, but changed his mind. The guy looked away and said in a quiet voice that he hadn't even thought about such a thing. The father said that in this case he should not indulge the girl in the future, even if she came herself. He told the guy not to even think that he could stay close to Rachel. Of course, he would never allow that. Some time passed since then, and Leon beat his son again so that he could barely move. When Lucien left the office, he thought that it was indeed true. He envied Rachel, but he never even thought about using her for his own purposes. The boy could not understand what he had to do, what he had to learn, so that his father would finally notice him and praise him at least once, and not just beat him and scold him. Lucien limped to his room, and suddenly that same angry voice appeared next to him, saying that everything was useless. No matter how hard he tried, nothing would change anyway. This voice simply screamed in his ear that no matter what the boy did, the Duke would never acknowledge him, much less love him. He might as well not even try anymore. He would always only disappoint him even more. Lucien was ready to burst into tears from these words, because he understood that it was really true. No matter how much effort he put in, his father always only scolded and scolded him. Although one would like to object to this voice and say that this is not so at all. But of course, the guy could not, because in fact, he also understood all this perfectly well. In his father's eyes, he was like a ghost without a shadow. Then suddenly that voice spoke to him again and told him to just give in, because there was no need for him to torment himself any longer. This voice asked Lucien to give him his body already, and in that case he would let him sleep peacefully and no longer see all this horror. At that moment, the guy had already closed his eyes and thought that this was really the best way in such a situation. But before he could answer, he suddenly heard the cheerful voice of a little girl. It was Rachel. She immediately smiled and said hello when she saw him. The guy, as if he had woken up from a dream, looked at her in surprise. He had not expected her to meet him so quickly. He was about to tell her something when suddenly the girl interrupted him and asked if he had any other things to do that day. Lucian said that of course the day wasn't over yet. That meant he still had a lot of things to do. Then Rachel smiled happily and said she wouldn't disturb him. She took him by the hand and began to lead him away, adding that she would have to walk with him to the room, and that was all. When Lucian felt her small hand on his, he immediately felt pleased. He thought that in this entire estate, only one person notices him. And it was Rachel, of course. The girl smiled happily and, pointing him in the direction, told him to go quickly so that he wouldn't fall behind schedule and get everything done on time. They continued to walk forward with slow steps because after the beatings from his father, Lucian could not move quickly. All Rachel could think about was that her favorite character had taken her hand and that she was now walking next to him. For her, it was something incredible. They walked in silence for a while. Then the girl turned to him and asked if it was true that his next scheduled task was to rewrite history books. The guy glanced at her and said that this was indeed the case, so he needed to go to his room and get down to business as soon as possible. But Rachel was very upset, because very soon they would reach his room, and she would have to leave. But she did not even want to let go of his hand. Then she came up with a plan and stopping said that her legs hurt a lot. The guy immediately looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. But Rachel immediately made a very pitiful expression on her face and asked if they could stop for a while to rest, since she definitely couldn't go any further. Lucian doubted for some time whether he would agree to this, because he understood that the punishment from his father would again be severe. And the girl at that moment was very worried, because she could not believe that he was thinking about leaving her and just walking away. But then suddenly the guy knelt down in front of her and offered to carry her. When Rachel heard this, she couldn't believe that he actually suggested it. Well, of course, she immediately agreed. And soon the girl found herself on his back. It was very hard for her to believe that her favorite was carrying her on himself because her legs hurt. Of course, she was incredibly happy with this opportunity because she loved this character very much and was ready to spend every minute of her life with him. Then she laid her head on his shoulder and enjoyed this wonderful moment. But then suddenly the guy turned to her. She was so immersed in her thoughts that she was even scared when he tore her away from her dreams. Rachel immediately jumped up and asked what he wanted, and the guy, pointing to the side, said that they had already reached his room, so she needed to get off. She quickly climbed off his back and then, smiling, thanked him for agreeing to carry her, since she really wanted to accompany him. Lucian didn't show any cheerful expression at all, but only said that she needed to go and rest, because she was probably very tired, and he needed to get back to work. Rachel waved him goodbye quickly and wished him strength in the remaining tasks before leaving. Then the door closed, and the girl thought that this upset her, because she so wanted to be with him longer. But, unfortunately, she could not allow herself to do so. When Lucian entered the room and closed the doors behind him, he felt very upset that he could not spend as much time with his sister as he would like, because she is the only one who understands and accepts him for who he is. The next day, Rachel tried to go to her stepmother again, and the maid finally allowed her to do so and said that her mistress was practically expecting her. The girl was simply delighted that the Duchess had finally allowed her to greet her, and even began to worry a little about it. When the doors opened, the maid immediately told them to come in, because the mistress was already waiting for them. Before entering, the maid also told the Duchess that Lady Orlando had arrived. When Rachel heard this, she was very surprised, because the maid did not call her my lady, but only Lady Orlando. This, of course, upset her a little, but she thought that there was nothing critical about it. The main thing was that only the Duchess cared about Lucian, and the attention she could show towards her was completely unimportant. When the girl went inside, she immediately saw a beautiful duchess who was sitting on a couch near the window and looking into the distance. Rachel immediately bowed and stated her name, saying that she was very glad to greet the lady. Then suddenly, the woman interrupted her and asked if the girl was familiar with the word mirage. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked again what she meant. The duchess, without taking her eyes off the window, said that they say that in the country that borders the empire there is a desert covered entirely with dry sand. And she heard a story about a traveler who got separated from his caravan and wandered alone in the desert for several days. And wandering along the road and suffering from thirst, the traveler came across an oasis with clear water right in the middle of this very desert. And rushing with all his might to this oasis, he scooped up as much water as possible and immediately began to drink it. However, once the water entered the mouth, it turned out to be only coarse sand. It was just an illusion. In other words, you could call it a mirage. Rachel stood and looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was telling this story at all. But then suddenly the Duchess turned to the girl and asked what she thought. And she asked, "Do mirages really only happen in deserts at high temperatures when you feel bad? Or do they also occur in real life?" Rachel didn't respond to this, so the Duchess said that she really hoped that the girl would never plunge her head into the sand, mistaking a mirage for an oasis. She looked at her in surprise and immediately realized that this was probably a warning. The Duchess was hinting that what she was now enjoying was just a mirage. She had just been warned not to let her guard down, deceived by an illusion that would simply disappear one day. So, smiling slightly, the girl said that she understood everything. But of course, she herself did not plan to stay in this house forever. She just wants her favorite Lucian to find happiness and finally live the life of an ordinary person. And then she would have nothing more to regret. So, smiling, Rachel told the Duchess not to worry because she would definitely disappear when that day came. At this very time, Lucian was, as always, on his training ground. He was practicing with the ball, and when he got a little tired, he decided to catch his breath. Looking to the side, the guy saw nothing, and this made him a little wary, because usually Rachel came at this time, and then suddenly she was gone. He assumed that she was probably just a little late that day, but then he suddenly heard that annoying and terrible voice again. This hoarse voice turned to the boy and asked if he really thought that this child would always seek to meet him. Lucian, when he heard it, immediately froze in place, and the voice continued to speak. He said that the guy himself saw how the Duke treated her differently, and she could even take away his place as heir. However, nothing of the sort happened. Rachel was simply with the Duchess the entire time, and soon, finally, their meeting ended, and the girl left. As she walked down the corridor, she thought that, as she had expected, the Duchess was not at all happy about her appearance. But nevertheless, she would have to live with her under the same roof for some time, so she needed to establish a relationship with her. As Rachel walked further and further, the butler suddenly came out to meet her and asked Milady whether the meeting with the Duchess had gone well. But without waiting for an answer from her, he said that the Duke was calling her to him, so she had to go. When Rachel heard this, she was very surprised. She did not know why the Duke had suddenly decided to call her. However, without thinking twice, she went to the Duke accompanied by her maid, and the maid, before the girl entered, told the Duke that she had arrived. The man immediately became very happy and told her to come in quickly. After that, smiling, he added that he had called her so that they could go for a walk together. When she heard this, she was very surprised and asked what he meant. Leon explained that they would go out and buy whatever she wanted, eat delicious desserts from the pastry shop, and generally have a good time. Rachel immediately became happy and smiling said that, of course, she agreed to this. Of course, the man didn't expect any other reaction, so he said that he had already ordered the carriage to wait so they could leave right away. At that moment, he took her hand. However, Rachel stopped them and said that she had one question. And then she asked, "Won't the older brother go with them?" As soon as Leon heard this, his face became very serious and even angry. He asked the girl if she really didn't want to go for a walk alone with her father. When Rachel saw this reaction, she immediately thought that it was probably not the time for that yet. So she replied that she certainly wouldn't mind going for a walk with just him. Rachel called him Duke, but then the man suddenly stopped and said that he would be glad if she called him Dad. The girl, hearing this, looked at him in surprise and could not believe that he really wanted her to do this. But then she suddenly saw sadness on the man's face, and he, sighing heavily, said that he understood everything, that she was still uncomfortable about this, so they could take their time. Rachel, when she heard these words, immediately began to smile and thought that it would be very difficult for them to become a real family. But later, he would definitely change his feelings. Then the two of them went to the exit, and the Duke asked her if she was ready to go and have fun. To this, she immediately jumped up and said that of course she was ready for it. Lucian had already finished his training at this point and returned to the estate. From that moment on, he couldn't get rid of the thought that Rachel could really take the place of the successor. But he didn't understand how that was possible, because he wanted to do it so hard for his father. He puts in so much effort, and she does almost nothing. However, at that moment the guy stopped, leaned against the wall, and realized that he couldn't breathe again. Lucian began to choke. He tried to swallow air with his mouth, but it didn't work out well. Then suddenly he raised his head and saw two servants who were passing by. However, they only looked at each other and walked on calmly. These guys completely ignored the fact that Lucian was feeling unwell and couldn't even take a basic breath. Some time passed from that moment, and the guy could not stand on his feet. He fell to the ground and continued his attempts to breathe. Then suddenly Rachel ran up to him. When she saw him on the floor, she immediately became worried and asked if something really hurt him. She was really very worried and asked him loudly, pronouncing each word, "What was wrong happened." At this point, Lucian finally brought his breathing back to normal and looked at the girl in surprise without answering. He understood perfectly well that this child was different from all the others, and that was why she undoubtedly deserved all the best. Before the guy felt bad, the voice addressed him again and asked if this was even true, because in the end, he would lose absolutely everything he had if he just gave up. This voice said that if he gave up his place to Rachel, he would become even more pathetic than he already was. Before Rachel returned with her father back to the estate, they went shopping and also to various confectionaries, buying delicious and beautiful things. As soon as Rachel saw something beautiful and looked at it for more than a second, the man would immediately come up to her and ask if she liked it. But without waiting for an answer, he immediately told the sellers that he would take all the goods that were on the other side, and that was it. Of course, Rachel didn't like all this because she had already bought enough and she simply didn't need any more goods. But at that moment, the girl also understood why the real Rachel grew up so selfish, because she simply bathed in luxury. And her father bought her absolutely everything she wanted, and at such a pace, it is very easy to become arrogant. When the man was about to buy her something again, she immediately turned to the Duke and said that this was quite enough and that she didn't need anything else at all. But the man, who really liked giving her gifts, asked if this was true when she confidently said yes. He suggested going and eating something tasty because she was probably very tired while they were walking, and choosing different things for her.